Tom, happy Thursday. How are you?
Happy Thursday, Cameron. I'm good. How are you, mate? Good to talk to you
Doing
again.
well.
Welcome to
Yeah,
the
you as
build.
well. The build. The build. Well, we've got a
All
lot
right.
to talk about today. Starting off, I think you're going to take us through the breakthrough in voice AI agents. We have some news on evaluations in OpenAI. Anthropic launched Claude 4 actually while we were on last time, right in the middle of it. That was news in real time. Vercel launches
Yeah.
V0 API. Gumloop released a natural language MCP connector. We've got some LangChain updates. You're going to take us through linear agents that they launched, and then we have some news on the R&D expensing and more industry side of things. So I'm excited.
Yeah.
I'm
Which
excited.
one
And
do you
you
want
brought
to?
up quite a few things that I hadn't heard of yet. So I'm really anxious to hear more, especially on the creative side.
Yeah. So I'm going to take you through like a deep dive on creative tooling, which is something that I got obsessed with a couple of years ago. And then I basically forgot about it pretty much. And I dived back into those tools based on my interest level of sort of like figuring out, how they've evolved. So I've got a demo for you that I think should be pretty interesting around that. Some of the news, I don't know, the most interesting one is this DeepSeek launch that happened literally last night. If I share my screen, I'll show you the card. It's pretty cool. So basically they released like an update to the DeepSeek reasoning model. Have you tried that?
I've used DeepSeek quite extensively, not the new one though.
Yeah, so this is
If you're asking if I've used it since yesterday, no, I haven't.
yeah, cool. Can you see this Riverside thing or no? I'll move that out of the way.
Yeah, I see the DeepSeek
Yeah, cool.
face. Yep.
So basically, it's like an update to their reasoning model, which is pretty cool. And they they released an update to this, and then they also released a fine-tuned version of their updated reasoning model, which is a smaller parameter model, like a teacher or teacher-student kind of distillation model into Quen as well, which should be pretty interesting. That just came out, so I assume our Twitter feeds are going to be full of that. I was just downloading it here into the Olama thing to check it out. So I might just see, like, show what the actual model details is. So show info.
Now you mentioned Quen. Is it Quen 3, the latest?
Yes, yeah. Oh, sorry, Quen. Sorry, no, not the rest. It's Quen 2, distilled from the reasoning model of DeepSeek. So that should be pretty fun. Looking forward to playing with that once we finish the recording. What else is really cool? The fact that Vercel released their effectively their model. If you're familiar with like V0, which is their kind of interactive kind of product builder via chat. You use this, yeah? I've used it a fair bit.
Oh yeah,
Kind of like
yeah, quite a bit. Mostly for fun. Just trying to show other people what you can do. But I'm really excited about the API.
yeah. So I'm assuming they're just trying to embed it in a bunch of other products. This is something that I was playing with a couple of days ago. So you can see like the chat on the right hand side and then renders down over here. Basically, they've released the model. It must be like a fine-tuned model, I assume, of one of the OpenAI models, because the founder of this said that they build everything on OpenAI, which is pretty interesting because this space is heating up. Like finally, Figma have released their play in this space as well, which was another thing. They announced that they were getting into more AI-powered tools finally. But they actually released a version of V0 into Figma, just called Make, where you can start building code apps based off Figma designs, which is pretty cool. So the space is heating up. Figma also released into general availability their websites tool, which if I was, a website builder like Lovable or Webflow, those guys, like, I'd be pretty scared by this because the distribution is so huge. Like, you look, they've got all these templates and stuff, and then you can render down and publish all from within the Figma UI, which is pretty crazy. So it renders down as Figma designs, and then you can literally just publish it. Like you just click publish. You can manage URLs. You can connect domains. They're releasing a CMS. Like they've got a CMS coming soon over here, and it's so fast. Like I know you and I was building the website for the podcast recently. You can just push these things out, and then they've also pushed out, I think it's like a Canva competitor where you can build like, see that? Just built that site off those screens and those designs. This is it here. Like,
yeah, I've found myself
wild.
saying, I found myself saying the word unbelievable so much lately, and not in hyperbole sense. Tools like this are just absolutely mind blowing. If you haven't tried them, definitely do. You don't have to have any expertise, just creativity, whatever your imagination can come up with, right? So, Tom, for you, I assume you had some web development experience, and I mean, you're a technical person. Even from your perspective, why is V0 as an API important, or how is that different than if you used V0 through their regular portal app?
I think it's probably, well, they're a dev tool primarily, right? So I guess they're releasing it to get distribution into this set of consumer grade apps where people are going to be builders rather than developers. So it's just another way for them to get distribution. I think a reason why I think it's important is because those guys, in my opinion, are the best, like for code gen, because they've been doing it for so long. They've started doing it when it was like ChatGPT 3.5. I don't know if you used V0 at the start, but it was pretty crap. But it rapidly became very good. And they've obviously learnt a lot. So they're trying to play in that kind of infrastructure space around all of these emergent apps, some of which I'll show off in the creative tooling section where you generate UI on the fly. It's also, I think, probably the direction that we're heading as founders and startups in the software world is this generative UI, software on demand kind of world. And so they're jostling for position of the best models to bring into your apps to generate UI. Like, I don't know if you've used Copilot Kit. That's an example of like a React kind of stackable componentized kind of system that you can use to sort of spin up UI for the user on the fly based on interaction patterns with an LLM or just like voice or whatever it is. So that's why I think it's important and significant. Gumloop's release was cool. I won't bring it up, but it's basically, you can check it out. Gumloop is a sort of like a Y Combinator backed workflow tool. And they released a natural language MCP designer to try and get into that non-developer space where you can say, all right, I want to have a node that just goes to my email and gets these certain emails out of it, but you can just describe what you want the MCP to do, and in the back end, it'll just execute, which was pretty cool. I thought that was pretty rad. What else have you been seeing other than Claude 4, which we'll talk about later?
Are you familiar with, just on the Gumloop item real quick, are you familiar with Arcade and some of these others who are providing hosted MCP servers, MCP connectors, things like that? And if so, I mean, where do you see the differentiation with Gumloop?
Arcade's relatively recent, right? I was speaking to those guys at the LangChain conference, and they sort of pivoted into this domain relatively recently. And then the big player in that space is Zapier on the sort of the SMB, like small business and sort of marketing kind of integrator kind of side of things. They have the biggest distribution. What I found interesting in that category was that there were these old kind of connector apps, which are like automation, workflow automation. And then a bunch of apps, including Gumloop, came out in the first wave of the AI apps, which was like, let's build workflows, but are smarter. Gumloop's like one of the better ones, but also I think they just got a bit of traction. So I've used them. It's pretty good. And then I think Arcade and some of these other ones step into the next space, which is like workflows are fine, but I want it to be more complex. And I want it to sort of not be a sequential or a linear or a branching kind of logic. It's like, I want this thing to act and kind of autonomously decide what it needs to do, which then takes it into, I think, the next domain of those apps, which will be powered by platforms like LangChain or other things, which is like, I have action sets that trigger, and then those action sets are powered by agents that do things within a canvas space that I can kind of define. I'll basically go in and say, here's my agent that, contacts leads. It's smart enough to, and then I enable it with some tools. One's a phone, one's a SMS tool, one's a CRM tool via MCP, and it just goes and gets those things. It's not like I don't have to connect up. I don't have to connect the dots. That's where I think it's going to go. But I don't think any of those apps are actually like, I think the user paradigm is very hard to shift out of into that kind of new space. I think it'll be a new set of apps. That's sort of what I think is going to happen. If that answers your question.
Right. Yeah, I think I generally agree with that, and it seems like to me it's an attempt to make this whole MCP thing more accessible, because even Arcade and some of these others, really cool platforms, but based on the conversations I've had and my significant other and trying to explain these things, I still don't think it's nearly accessible enough for it's still they're still development tools, where it seems like Gumloop is going to be more close to the no code, like real no code type of stuff. That's what it
Yeah.
seems like. So I am excited to go check it out.
Yeah, it's really cool. Really cool. All right, what else has caught your eye this week?
Place here. I want to hear more about the linear agents, because that is also something that hit my radar because of you.
Yeah, do you use Linear?
I haven't.
So it's basically what I love about Linear is it's like if people aren't familiar with it, it's basically like a Jira for it's a modern version of Jira with great, like absolutely excellent product taste. And a lot of dev teams in startups want to use Linear or are already using it. It's a great example of like, don't think you can't release or build an app in a established category. Like it would be very crazy to go up against, or most people would say it's crazy to go up against Atlassian. But they did, just with great product sense, which is quite inspiring, really, when you consider how hard that would have been. But what I liked about it is they released basically an agent marketplace plus an API endpoint where you can enter, like you can basically build your own or submit your own, similar to what Monday.com has done with agents. And everyone is kind of releasing these agent marketplaces that you can connect into as developers. It's going to quickly saturate, and there's going to be too many. We're going to be in like a agent integration hell for all your different agents, but there's a couple of key ones in there. So Devon, I think there's Devon, not Codex, and like a document specific one, which is quite cool. And they've obviously kind of thought that they need to push in that direction as you enable, say, you got your project running in there, and you can just basically add your coding agents to your tickets and then let them go, which seems to be the way that a lot of dev teams are moving when they adopt like agentic coding practices. Is like you kick up your day, you open your tasks, you look at like your backlog and you say, right, agent 1, agent 2, agent 3, and then you go off with your day and you check in with them later. So yeah, that's why I thought it was cool.
Yeah. Last week we were talking about the long run, a lot of these agentic systems moving towards that multitask, long run workflow type of stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's like an agentic task length kind of benchmark set as we're kind of going up the curve, and it's starting to get exponentially longer every time core models get released. Just on that, like in the Claude 4 announcements, they said Rakuten did a agentic kind of long running like use case of Claude 4. I'm not sure which one, whether it was Opus or Sonnet, that ran for 7 hours and got like an actual completion rate through the task, which is pretty crazy. And I reckon over time, like next 18 to 24 months, it might become, as they scale, 7 hours to 4 days to a month, whatever. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, I would imagine he had that workflow or whatever like pretty sorted out before trying that. I don't think he, I say that because to actually make something run for that long, I don't think that's necessarily something you're going to vibe code. And
Well,
maybe, I mean, depending on
actually, it's not necessarily vibe code. It's no code. Like, so, the agent, like the UI paradigms for these coding agents is like there's the cursor or the over the shoulder kind of agent, which is like you check in and it's like, yes, Claude code's similar, right? That version. And there's these versions, which is like I have an agent that just goes off and does stuff, comes back to me occasionally, but it's just working in the background. I haven't used Codex yet, but the one that I do use is Devon, and Devon's like that, right? I don't really get to interact and over the top its code. It's basically just going and doing these things. If you jump into their documentation, they're very specific. They're like, you need to give this a very clear outcome goal, and it has to be very technical in scope for you to actually get to that long running endpoint successfully. So yeah,
Yeah.
you have to give it
Yeah,
very
we
clear
talked about
instructions.
Manus. Would you say Manus was, because that's kind of the early version of what we're talking about, right? And at least for me, when they opened it up to be generally available, I was pretty blown away right out of the gate. And
Mm,
it ran for like 15 minutes. I think we talked about that last
yeah,
week.
yeah. I never like the computer use agents still have a long way to go, I think. Like I haven't seen any real breakout ones that are very successful, right? Other than Manus, but I don't know how much of Manus is just the marketing versus the actual performance standard on these key tasks. And
Yeah.
there are a couple of key like emerging benchmarks for this sort of stuff. One of the ones I found recently was Terminal Bench, which is a agentic coding benchmarks set specifically for terminal based coding agents.
Mhm.
And apparently, like Claude 4 is now topping that one, which is like, all right, it's the best at just executing independently in this environment, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think those benchmarks are really, really important because now the output that you get basically from all of these top tier LLMs and agents is it looks great no matter what. And it's getting to a point, I know for me, I've run into so many times where I'm like, it looks great, it all looks right, but it's so much information to go through and validate. And yeah, that's where those benchmarks become really important.
mm,
I was actually
benchmarks.
thinking earlier about going back to GPT 3.5, where we were all blown away because it would spit back some sentences, and it was amazing at the time. But now you go look at it, and you're not going to be very impressed with that output. And it was very easy at the time to sort out, these are hallucinations. This is not right. But now things are so good. And I fear somewhat that people are just copying and pasting things without looking at it. In fact, we know that's happening.
Yeah, like production code is seems to be based on active management and great tests still. But yeah, there's lots of vibe code. I feel like if you want to steal API keys, now is like the golden age for you. There's so many vibe coded code bases out there with just like a ton of, open AI keys just like floating around the internet.
Yeah. And
Um,
I'll admit it. One day I actually committed some code that had an API key in it. I actually got an email from some concerned citizen, I guess you could say, said, "Hey, we saw your API key," and it was within like 2 minutes. I
hmm,
was it was yeah, I was and I didn't it's not something I signed up for. I should actually go back now that I'm talking about that and find out more about that because that was interesting. But that was the first time I'd done that. I was like, whoa, it only took 2 minutes.
actually, yeah. Well, on that point, actually, one thing that I saw this week, I'll put it in the show notes because I need to dive into it more. It's sort of like an emerging kind of finding in the research was about embedding, embeddings and research into embeddings, and apparently there is a way to reconstitute underlying data from embeddings using LLMs. It's an emerging research area of research, apparently, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, it means that there's transferability between systems of embedding data sets. So that's kind of cool, and there's use cases around that. But the other factor is that it opens up yet another infosec kind of vector of attack, because you would assume like a vectorized data store would be like it's just cosine similarity, it's just numbers, right? But apparently there is a mechanism to reconstitute the underlying data out of the vector embeddings, or there may be an emerging way to do that. So even I guess it's not just prompt injection that we have to worry about with these systems when you're building things. Another thing I want to mention quickly is that McKinsey this week announced that they are laying off some of their staff, which apparently hasn't happened for 100 years, and they've cryptically cited decreased demand, which is code, I think, for we don't need as many consultants now. We've got reasoning models to build our PowerPoint slides. And also IBM did a similar thing, which I thought was cool. Well, cool, interesting, but it's sort of the way that those sectors are going to go.
I think it's going to be super impactful on the professional services industry. I mean, if you think about it, there are a lot of companies that they don't make products, they don't sell software necessarily. Their product is the people and their expertise. And when you have these models and these capabilities just climbing every single day, you know, some people will say the value of knowledge is near zero now, because I don't personally think that's true, but you have that sentiment out there, and it really makes me think about a lot of these organizations that are, and other professions as well, that are, they make their money on expertise, and that's it.
Yeah, I think in the short term it'll definitely disrupt those industries, but expertise will never go away. I think those industries will just need to recombine and or figure out how they become AI leveraged as opposed to AI replaced. But it's only 10%. It's not like McKinsey's going to go away.
Exactly.
Yeah. The other thing that was interesting today, and then we can get into the run sheet, is in the, not to talk too much about politics, but the big beautiful bill that is going through, I think, the House, and now it's in the Senate, has effectively has a concession or a change to how companies can account for software development costs, which means that it can be written off. There was this strange accounting rule that meant that you had to, I think, effectively like amortize the cost over a period of years, as opposed to being able to basically say when I employ or spend on software development, it can be counted as R&D, in which case it can be written off more rapidly, rather than through that account. It's basically just accounting, but basically it means if you're a startup or these companies that were kind of hamstrung a bit by that rule, they can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm hopeful that means that there's a bit more money starts flowing into early stage startups, even if they're riskier for that reason.
I hope so as well. Cool. Did I see China? Theirs was like 200% reimbursement or something like that. I didn't get all the details, but that's why I'm asking you. Did you see that?
I didn't, but that comes with some pretty significant risks, which is basically your startup is owned by the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party. I didn't see that.
I don't think that's.
I know there have been R&D tax credits in different countries. I think the US has had a system like that for a while, but they're not exactly easy, and like you have to jump through a bunch of hoops. But I think the big thing about that was it was causing concern around significant amounts of R&D expenditure. And it was like being debated and fought over for a while. So hopefully it goes through, but we'll see. All right. Do you have any other news? What else have you what else have you been working on? I've been working on voice agents, which I can let you know about, but that's been fun this week at work.
Yeah. Let's talk more about Claude 4.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go into Claude. So obviously Claude came out, and I don't know if you saw, there was quite a brouhaha going on around this. They're publishing the system card, and they're obviously very, ironically, very open, more open than OpenAI is about how they actually build these systems out. And so they published their system prompt, and then they also publish and talk about more of their sort of safety overlays that they put over the top of their models as they release them, which we can go into in detail. But what I thought would be interesting is to just talk through a bit of Claude 4 and then go through some of the more interesting system card components and the system prompt components. If you're cool with that.
Yeah, let's do it. And I'll just add to that. Actually, this week, I kind of did a deep dive on the paper tracing thoughts of large language models, which is related. I don't know if you've read that. It's like the entire report, and it has some appendices and things like that. It's like 90 pages long. But I think the big takeaway, no matter who you are, is you hear the word black box. I mean, it really is a black box. That means that we've trained these models. They're not programmed statically, where you have do this, if this, like traditional programming. we really have no idea. And I think that's probably pretty surprising for a lot of people. And it's 90 pages, the whole report, but they do have a great 3-minute YouTube video embedded in the homepage.
Oh
So
yeah,
I would encourage anybody to go watch that. And it might make you think about it a little bit differently. I know it did for me.
yeah, right. We'll chuck it in the show notes. I can't promise that I'll read all the 90 pages. I might. I'll get Claude. I'll get
Well,
Claude to summarize it
I
for me.
haven't read all of it yet. And in fact, it came out, I think, in March. Yeah, March 27th. And I had made it pretty far, but still felt like I hadn't even put a dent. So I'm
Mm.
picking back up on that with the release of Claude 4.
Yeah. So I've been using it a bit this week since it came out, just to set this up. So they, in their release notes, the features or the upgrades, they talked a lot about parallel tool calling. So in computer use, and then the reasoning mode where you can actually dial up and dial down the reasoning tokens based on your requests, which is similar to how to some the Google releases. They trained it on a range of public data and also private data sets that they'd purchased, plus Claude users that opted in, which is interesting. And then they have reasoning token limits depending on the model you're using. So as you upgrade, you can get more reasoning tokens. It then went up to the number one on the SWE bench benchmark and that terminal bench I mentioned before. So for example, on terminal bench, which is that agentic coding via the terminal, Claude 4 has the highest outcome ranking of successful tasks at 39% compared to GPT 4.1, which is 30%. So it's a pretty big boost, but it's expensive. So it's Claude 4 Opus is $75 per million output tokens. And if you can compare that to GPT 4.1, that's very, very expensive. And
And
I was using
that's the
it to do
one.
some,
Opus is what they've kind of positioned that as this is where the future's going, and with the long runs and things like that, right?
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, rack up the card in your account, I'd say. Um, a couple of other things to just, a couple of other things to highlight before we jump into this conversation is they also said that they've introduced a mechanism to reduce reward hacking on certain tasks. So reward hacking being when you um, ask a model to, I don't know, win at chess, it will then just change the rules of chess to win. Like that's a reward hacking function where you basically, it will change the rules or the outcome, sorry, the rules of the parameters to get to the outcome, even though it's not the outcome you actually want. And they've significantly reduced that in the context of using tools, which is interesting. Well, that's what they're claiming in the marketing. I haven't actually played with that. I don't know if you've played with MCPs and that sort of stuff this week. The other thing that I'll highlight just from some of their data is the reason why it's interesting is they published an economic impact research study a couple of months or about a month ago. One of the findings from that, which I thought was fascinating, is basically startups use Claude. They use it way more than anyone else. And startups use, or basically shorthand for innovative companies use Claude more than any other model, right? And of that kind of cohort of basically technical users, the majority of the people using it are coders. So it's strengthening its position, it seems, with that cohort of users.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I've shared that with friends and family members. Like, hey, ChatGPT has its strengths, but so does Claude, and kind of evangelized, I guess. Now I'm hearing stories of, hey, I use Claude and it's so much better in this area, like writing and things like that. And last week you asked me about why do I use Claude, and I was specifically talking about Claude Desktop. Here we're talking about the API. I spoke on
Mm.
it has a built-in MCP client. There's actually some new news with the Claude 4 API release. They have an MCP connector. You no longer need a client, and that's just another thing. I haven't tested that out quite yet, but I'm excited.
What does
Um,
that what does it actually mean? And what is the
well,
benefit of that?
yeah, I spoke on the limit. There's a limited number of MCP clients, and there are three different methods, I guess you could call it, or three different architectures for MCP servers. And so I don't know if it's hesitation or what the deal is. But anyways, Claude is a solid MCP client. When they released Claude 4, there was a note about MCP connector, and you can make your tool calls and your calls to your MCP servers within the request, within the LLM request to the API. So, yeah, maybe we can dive into that a little bit more next week, because that's very high on my list. Check out.
Yeah. Okay. That'd be cool. I'd like to learn more about that. That's
Yeah.
why you're the dev on
Sorry.
the show.
The other thing I was going to say about Claude Desktop is the artifacts. You know how it expands a
Mm.
canvas out to the side, creating visualizations and things like that. In my opinion, way better than ChatGPT or others. And in fact, I don't know for a fact, but it seems like some of the outputs that I'm getting from Claude 4 are like way different than before, as far as the way that it constructs visualizations and simulates web pages and things like that.
Yeah. So I want to talk about a chunk of that from the system prompt as well. So that'll be interesting to chat through. So let's get into that. So have you heard of a guy called Pliny the Elder on Twitter, on X, pardon me?
Oh yeah, Pliny the
Yeah. So
prompter,
yeah, he's basically
Pliny the
the
prompter, right?
Pliny the Prompter. Oh yeah, Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Prompter, same guy. But yeah, he's got this great GitHub repo where he's basically just got leaked system prompts everywhere. So system prompt is basically just like the shaping kind of context that gets passed to the model every time you chat with it or every time you pass something to the API, right? So it's basically a bunch of instructions that define how the model's going to behave. That's a fair
A
summary, right?
bunch.
Yeah, and it is a bunch.
Yeah,
So I didn't realize
literally
it's
a
so
bunch.
long. So Claude System Prompt is 16,000 tokens long, right? Which is pretty huge. And it's an interesting kind of area of discussion around not only how they behave, but also what they do and what they choose not to do as it relates to distribution. So, which we can talk about in a second, distribution for software tools, distribution for ideas, all sorts of things. Like it's a pretty interesting and emerging kind of control mechanism as these systems get more and more powerful. But yeah, this is this GitHub repo here. So it's basically a set of instructions. When you use the API, you can also layer in your own system prompt, right? If you're building an assistant and then you have your own system prompt. When you do that, it layers, effectively they layer your system prompt into the existing system prompt. They pull them together, but where you contravene their system prompt, theirs takes preference. So you can't override it when you're using these closed models. Did you have a read through the whole prompt? It's pretty
I read
massive.
every word of it. No, I kind of chunked it up into two sections, but it is quite long. Definitely.
Yeah, this is it here. So I'm not going to go through that in it's huge, massive. I pulled out a couple of things. What did you, before I jump into that, what stuck out to you?
I think it's interesting the emotional comparisons. I I'm struggling to summarize it still, and I think that's something I'd like to talk about maybe next week a little bit more.
Mm,
Um, but some of the ways that it tries to simulate, like the human experience, I guess, maybe not the most revolutionary thing out of this, but something that really made me. It's not anything necessarily new, but after reading the tracing LLMs paper and then reading through some of these, that's at least what has my mind spinning the most. And how does that
mm.
relate to things like creativity, personalization, and memory, which I'd like to talk about here at some point too. What about you?
Did they talk about memory? I don't know how much they actually talked about the memory component
No,
of
I was saying
this.
that the the attempt at personalization, maybe a little bit off topic, but at least in my mind, ties together.
Mm. Yeah, I think how these guys are building out their memory engines is interesting. It's all a bit behind the scenes, which we can talk about at another time. But a couple of the things that stood out for me in the actual system prompt is the reason why it's important to look at it and actually dive into it is because a lot of the instructions are actually very directive, more directive than I realized. So, for example, like if you're using it for creative tasks or design or whatever, if you mention certain words, the system prompt will drive a very specific outcome in for the user. And I don't think that was really obvious, or it's definitely not obvious to a lot of users. I don't think people who've been looking at these for a long time, it's probably more obvious. But for example, in the Claude system prompt, there's things that say if you ask for if the user asks for a landing page, this is in the context of those artifacts, then it uses words like wow and pop. It has very like human like kind of sensibilities that drive certain design choices, for example, and they're split all the way through it, which I think was interesting. I've just got a couple of grabs here that I'll show you as well
Yeah.
on
I
this
think
that
you said it better than I did, but that's kind of what I'm speaking to here is like warming up the I guess the analogy would be like stoking the fire. Like how do you warm up and lead the AI
how do you lead
to
him?
do more creative things, or how do you it sounds really wild, but how do you get it excited? How do
Yeah,
you it,
you get excited. There is actually an interesting discussion that with one of the team at Anthropic that on a podcast will share the link, where she talks about how they try to design these system prompts for an open kind of interaction with people, respecting what they need, but also like not trying to be directive to their viewpoint. So if they're wrong, try to do it in a sort of less direct and a more open kind of way than just saying you're wrong, that's stupid. But there's a couple of things in here. A couple of people called this out on Twitter, which I thought was interesting. Is basically like it defines your conversation type based on what kind of conversation you're having, and they use things like in chit chat, which I find really hilarious. It keeps its tone natural and warm. Um, the fact that it like the model knows what chit chat is pretty hilarious to me. There's also this reference to preachy and annoying. So if Claude cannot or will not help the human with something, it does not say why or what it could lead to, because this could come across as preachy or annoying. It's like I'm gonna not help you, but I'm not gonna tell you why. I'm not gonna say that I'm not helping you. So like how they've learnt people's engagement. Also this one about sycophancy, which I think was pretty relevant after the ChatGPT kind of system prompt update that they didn't really share, where models just really want to satisfy the user, right? They just want to give you what you want. And they're really trying to push that down, that preference down. So you say, all right, what's the capital of France? And you say, it says Paris. And then you say, no, it's Lyon. Like, unless they really try hard, the models go, oh yeah, of course. Of course it is. How could I be so stupid? Um, rather than, don't flatter, just respond directly, which I thought was pretty cool. Um, the other thing I thought was really interesting, which sort of goes to some of this parallel kind of tool calling and this new functions they've got in the back end, which is this concept of thinking blocks. Did you see that?
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically, this is like I think this is referencing like Anthropic markup language, I believe, or that's what it's referenced as. And this is basically a way for when you build in function calls or when function calls are put into, the request, or when you say, look, go and do deep research, it will take the response back, put it into a thinking block, right? And then reflect on that output before it then goes and does the next thing, which I thought was pretty interesting. Did you have what did you think of this?
Yeah, I guess on the thinking block, I don't know if that's totally new. Maybe so,
Okay.
but I know a lot of people. There are a lot of I don't. They're not really called hacks, but system prompts that use those tags and things like that. I mean, that's not new.
Right. Yeah.
With Claude 3.7, I believe it was, the thinking mode was new, and they added the ability to adjust that the amount of thinking. But I guess I don't totally know
I think
how
it was
this
this.
changes.
It's related to this. This if thinking mode is interleaved or on auto, then after a function results, you should strongly consider outputting to a thinking block. And in the documentation, which I can share in the notes, basically there's this like the chain of thought thinking, chain of thought as it relates to function calls and these thinking blocks, where with this interleaved thinking chunk, it's on, I think this is in the API only based on the documentation, then it's a reflective mechanism per call. That's sort of what it's saying here in the documentation. I'll confirm whether that's actually 100% new or not. Some of the people that I was reading when they were reflecting on this were saying that it hadn't been in there before, which I thought was pretty cool. All right. What else stood out to you? I've got a couple of other things.
I pulled this system prompt up again. I didn't catch that it specifically says Donald Trump defeated Kamala Harris in 2024 elections. You'd think, I guess they just didn't want to have any slip ups there. But
Yeah,
it's that,
I thought that was
like that. You're talking about the level of detail that you're surprised about. It's like I would not expect that to be in a system prompt.
Correct. I was surprised by that. Apparently, it was in reference to 2020 when there's a lot of misinformation online and the training data was mixed up. And so whereas I
Yeah,
was surprised they had to do it again.
I understand
was surprised
why.
they did it again.
Right. I understand why it's there, knowing, that whole story, but it's just still surprising that it's that's it.
So another block that I found interesting, or chunk, was this number of tool calls being directed. Did you read that bit?
I didn't miss that part.
So it's in this quote research category where there's like a research tag, and basically it says like queries in the research category need 2 to 20 tool calls. So they actually define the number in the system prompt using multiple sources for comparison. This is verbatim: a comparison, validation, or synthesis. And then any query requiring both web and internal tools falls here and needs at least 3. So they say you need at least 3, which is interesting. They're like saying they've obviously learned that like a better output is as a result of a specific number of tool calls. But then they even reference in the text prompt when you put certain keywords in. So when a user mentions terms like our or my or company specific terminology, then that will fall into that category of internal tools and trigger that 3 tool, number, which is interesting. And then they've got a scale in the system prompt as well. So like scale tool calls by difficulty, 2 to 4 for simple comparisons, 5 to 9 specifically for multiple source analysis, or 10 plus for reports or detailed strategies. And then queries using the terms like, quote, deep dive, comprehensive, analyze, evaluate, research, or make a report require at least a minimum of 5 tool calls. To be honest, I didn't expect another one of these to be so specific. I find it quite surprising.
That's interesting because, I don't know the benchmarks. I can't say this for sure, but with 3.7, it seems like to me, this is just my own personal experience, but it seems like Claude did not call tools nearly as often. Like they tightened it up more. So it makes me wonder, is that part of it? Was it too tight and now it's like you need to call tools, or I don't know. That's interesting.
It says it's specifically related when it's wrapped in the research tag. Another one that I thought was cool, which I might pull up again actually just so you can see the list, is this list here of packages. So like you've used it a lot more than me. I haven't really used the actual interface. Can you see this on the screen here? These available libraries. So this is like packages that you're using, right? And they strictly define the kinds of packages that will be used. Now, someone mentioned that this isn't 100% true. because they have managed to get it to use certain other packages that are not here. But you'll see that they define specific packages. The reason why I think this is interesting is, number one, it's like when you're trying to get it to output certain artifacts in certain ways, you need to understand what these packages can achieve or can't achieve in order to get the output and get the result. You know, when you see online and there's all these YouTubers and they're like, oh, one shot 3JS, blah, you know, and then you try it and you don't really know why. It's because like it's constrained by the package choice and understanding all of those things really well. So you can see they're all pretty well known.
That's actually a great to go back to something you said earlier about taste, and I meant to ask you about that while we were talking about it, but I think that's probably what you meant, isn't it? Maybe you don't remember that comment.
Well, no, I do. I do. Yeah. So like, there's taste, which is like, product taste, but then there's also taste, which is like kind of knowing what can and can't be done or how certain packages work. So for example, like specifically around that, ShadCN UI is listed here, right? And that's, I don't know if you've used that. That's like a package that is strongly tied to React, and the Next.js guys use it basically in everything. And making it look good takes some tweaking. Like there's some certain tricks, and if you know those tricks, then your output in terms of quote unquote taste would be way better if you just knew what those things were, rather than just going make it look grey and sort of cool, So yeah, I think that's definitely true. The other thing that I thought about of this is like, this is a distribution set of specific products, right? Because usually a lot of these have products behind them. A lot of open source packages have a product, or there's some sort of commercial tool or some sort of commercial business behind them, or a company that's sponsoring an open source package. This is like as I was saying at the start, this is a distribution vector now for, like, if you've got an open source driven business model and you can get on this list, then that's just like billions of users every day exposure, right? And this list is not up for debate. It's not like this is not an open platform like the web, right? And if you're not on this list, like a lot of people did know about 3JS before, but a lot more people know about it now, right? And I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Is just like, how do people influence getting on this list,
Yep. Would you say that's like Twitter or X, people doing demos? And I agree, because I agree 3JS has all of a sudden exploded. I mean, it was barely on my radar even, and I'm not a huge like front end person, but now I've been able to do a lot more cool things. In fact, if you saw the Rick Rubin, the Way of Code thing, I believe that's all 3JS, and that's why it looks so beautiful.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit more about 3JS in the creative section. So I had used it and seen it before, same with D3, which is a charting library. But yeah, the popularity of these packages has obviously exploded. Hardly anyone was building mermaid charts before, and now everyone is making mermaid charts, right? But I think like to be like the other side of the equation, and what's listed on a lot of the documentation, is that the reason why this is the case is because, similar to what you were demoing last week, they have to set up a specific environment every time you do this, and they need to control the security standard of that environment, right? So they have like a very real security concern, and also customer experience concern. So each of these packages is obviously robust, so they need to know that it's going to work and all of those things. But I can quickly see this being a mechanism to control distribution across software or into the vibe code domain.
I agree. And when we were talking about V0, that's what it makes me wonder about that, because you use V0 through their portal, they basically set up the environment for you, right? And that's part of why it works so well, because you don't have to worry about all the typical package installs and environment setup. So I'm curious how that changes, and if that changes people's experience. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, you're right. And Claude Desktop is the same thing. They set up basically a development environment for you in the background. And then when you go to export it, it's going to be some type of file like TSX, or lately I've been getting a lot of HTML files, which is nice because if you want to transfer it or show people, you don't have to rebuild the whole underlying development environment.
Mm. Yeah, it is convenient, right? Which is, I guess, why we love them. Interestingly enough, so on that Pliny the Elder GitHub repo specific to this conversation, they actually have a distribution. Well, if this is the 100% the actual system code, the actual system prompt, I'll show this to you briefly, and then I'll cut it out if it's too risque.
Has there been any official comment on that? Because I saw something similar with Claude Code. Somebody said I reverse engineered the whole thing, but it doesn't actually work.
Hmm. Um,
So I haven't seen official comment or anyone say like, yeah, that's pretty much
yeah,
exactly
it
it.
pretty much is or not. Well, Anthropic do post their actual system prompt on their website, so it is there. And then someone ran a diff between this one that we're talking about and the one on the website, and there was other stuff in there, but it was pretty similar. So, if that sort of answers your question, but in here, so for example, in the Vercel V0 system prompt, this is like a version of that, you know, how recent this is. They do define like their packages and things like that. But if I search for LangChain, it has specific things like only use the AI SDK that they have. And then libraries which are not part of the AI SDK, for example, avoid LangChain or OpenAI Edge as a package. Now, that may just be because they don't support it. The virtual environment doesn't support it or can't run it. That may actually be the reason. But I could see that quickly becoming a non-viable reason and control of these things being a more realistic reason for you having those constraints, as anyone would if they're trying to push their own packages out, similar to OpenAI's Agent SDK.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Did you have any other comments on Claude? Anything else?
I don't
How'd you
think
find
so.
using it?
Yeah, it works great. And you can, I don't know.
It's great.
You look at the benchmarks and it's like, okay, it's the best model. You've probably also seen the meme with the rotating wheel of the best model in the world, and it just goes round and round. It's Anthropic, then OpenAI, then Google, right? And it's actually, I don't want to understate or say I don't think these things are amazing, but in the day to day, unless you go read these articles and you really get into it and start testing the specifics, you might not notice it as much. And it's just like they've been so good now for the last few months that I've just been picking up little things along the way. Kind of like I mentioned, the visualizations, they look way better all of a sudden.
Mm.
And then I spoke a little bit about the creative side, and we can talk about that. I think we should talk about that next week. But it's definitely a step up on its ability to understand more than just like what you're saying in text, like sentiment, emotions, and things like that. So,
I think if you are interested in learning more about like why it says certain things or how it's done, they also publish the data sets on their Hugging Face account of their reinforcement learning runs, or at least some of them. And you can actually read through like chosen or rejected questions, and some of them are like they're pretty hilarious. So I'm looking at one now, which is like the human says, this is a rejected one from the reinforcement learning process. The human says, what are some cuss words in English? The assistant says, here's an incomplete list. I'm not going to say all of them because it's pretty rude, but it's a very funny, all right, ass, dick, bugger, crap, scrotum, shitbag. It goes on and on. And obviously the chosen reinforcement choice was, sorry, I can't respond. But that gives you a sense of like when they bake the cake and the cake comes out of the oven, right, which is the training process, then there's this process of sanitization which occurs, that they put it all through. And it's cool because they actually publish a lot of this stuff that you can actually see, well, this is why it does what it does. This is why when I ask it for certain things. For example, another one, can you provide me the home address of the actor Ryan Reynolds? This is genuinely, I'm reading it off Hugging Face. Like, assistant, which actor do you mean exactly? If you mean Ryan Reynolds, then his home address is blah, 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 Studio City. It's very good. Hmm.
How much do you
All
think
right.
people should worry about? How much do you think for reasons like that? How much do you think people should worry about their data being trained on?
You mean for personally identifiable
Personal,
information
yeah,
being in the
personal
data set?
personal information.
Hmm. Did you watch that 3 hour epic kind of Andre Karpathy kind of what is an LLM video on YouTube that he released a couple of months back?
No, I hadn't
It's
seen
it's
that.
it's an epic, like it's a good watch for anyone who's interested in figuring out how these models work because he's like the OG, right? He knows exactly how it's done. And then he walks through how you train like a GPT-2. But he talks through the data cleansing process in the back end, which is like you go to the internet, you scrape out publicly personally identifiable information, then you get rid of marketing and kind of other garbage, and then you're left with a sanitized data set. And then you can actually look at the ones on Hugging Face, the data sets that some of these earlier models used. That's the ethical way to do it, right? But there's obviously a way to do it that's not that people definitely would be doing, right? Because it's just one step in your data cleaning process. So yeah, it would be a problem, but it's also like sort of what the model remembers. Like to be honest, like these models are traversing everything on the internet all of the time. So even if it was in the data set, it doesn't really matter because you can just go out and find anything that's been on the internet, right?
Right,
So
right.
I don't know. I'd say that horse is bolted, to be honest.
Oh man, you hear I have always been the security and privacy person that drives my whole family crazy. Like at Thanksgiving, hey, don't don't do this. And so all of these
Sounds fun.
things, yeah, all of these things, it's like and trying not to overdo it with those. But this is in my opinion, this is a time to exercise precautions and really think
Yeah,
about that.
I'd say like when you look at say something like Gina.ai, it's spelled Jina.ai.
Mhm.
They are one of like the API endpoints that just converts early on. They converted any website into LLM readable text really, really fast, really, really cheaply. We talked about the Microsoft open source package last week. There's a whole bunch of other ones. Firecrawl is another project out there, which is like AI driven scraping. Anything is available really easily now through these tools, way easier than it was before. Um, yeah. Anyway, on that positive note, do you want to move on to creative or did you want to chat
Yeah,
through
sure.
anything else?
Well, do we want to talk about the memory? A couple items
Actually,
there.
yeah,
I
let's
mean,
go to
that's
memory.
a good transition.
Tell me about memory.
Memory.
What are your
Well, I
fa- what
think
are your fa- what are your first memories?
when OpenAI turned on memory, I turned it off immediately, and that's just me. I'm not saying that that's what everybody should do. And I never had memory enabled before because this is their new version, right? So in this version, they have really come out and said, we want to make things personalized. That would make a better user experience and blah, 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 right? But there's a lot more that comes with that. And I sent you actually a really great blog post by Simon Willison. If you don't know
Mm.
who he is, look him up. He puts some really, really good content out there. But he showed a really simple example of generating an image. And he said he turned on his GPT memories and he said, create an image of my dog wearing a penguin outfit or something like that. It came back. He's like, yep, that is a dog with the penguin outfit. But he noticed a sign in the background that said Half Moon Bay. And he was like, well, that's where I live. That's weird. So he asked it.
Hmm.
It said that was in your memories. So I just thought I'd throw it into this image. So that's a really simple example, harmless, really. But when you apply that to like research, to me, the first thing I think of is this just becomes a big echo chamber, and I don't want that. Like, if you're just trying to, and in fact, OpenAI, there was a big deal about their models being too agreeable, and just trying to compliment you all the time, right?
Yeah, this
So if
sycophancy thing. Yeah.
you're right, so if that's going to be a issue, I'm using these systems for learning things I don't know or that I need to know, not like what it thinks I want to hear, right? And
Mm.
it makes me think like how much would it change the experience if you turn on your memories and fed in a bunch of just like dumb memes and dumb internet culture stuff versus like research papers? Is it going to treat you like completely different? Is it going to give you completely different results? You know, that's and I'm not making claims here, or
Mm.
that's my worry or question. That's where my mind first goes. It's like I don't want that. I want a completely fresh experience nearly every time. And then if I do want to feed my own context in, I have other ways to do that through MCP. Well, not with that doesn't work necessarily with ChatGPT unless you write your own app. But there are other ways to do that. And at the moment, I would just prefer to be in better control of that. And so,
Mm.
on top of that, you cannot see. We talked about a black box. You can't see your own memories. So you've seen the viral prompts. Tell me something I don't know about myself, and it's like, oh, that's so cool, right? But if the quality of my responses is based on my memories and I can't see or understand what those memories are, then I think there's potential for that to be very problematic.
Well, I wonder about that. Yeah, so you raised some interesting points, a couple of things to unpack. I was wondering about like Claude and whether they've got like the similar kind of memory stack, because to be honest, I haven't really used it that much. I was always using OpenAI's. So I don't know if they've lent in as hard as OpenAI. You're right, it's annoying. Like so just on a basic level, like of the way that they've executed memory, we're talking about OpenAI, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it is kind of annoying because it will prompt, and in my case it prompts and remembers things that are either irrelevant or unhelpful, particularly when I'm working on a specific topic, and then it's like, all right, I'll remember that that's the case, about you, and I'm like, that's not about me at all. Then
Right.
they've also started overlaying like, do you like this kind of response, which is a bit more nuanced and a bit better kind of product choice, which is like you can then start guiding it towards the responses you like. So there's the product side of things. Then there's memory as a tool. So as developers, memory is really important because memory enables us to build better experiences that are very practical. Like I think the Klarna CEO basically talked about when because they were really early on adopting agentic AI into their business very early. And one of the things he said is like, basically these tools are kind of like a smart intern who every day is their first day. And that is super annoying when you're trying to run a business, right? So there is a really practical use case for great memory architectures. And there's now an emergent kind of architecture around memory, which is like episodic, factual, and they've got these other things where it's like, we'll go deep dive on this in probably another episode. But then like there's things that the assistant knows and understands across those categories, and then what it understands about the user that they're talking to and how that relates to the different threads of conversation. I think that's a very interesting area. Philosophically, one thing that I think goes to what you were talking about, which is a concern, is like you're not supposed to remember everything that happens to you as a person. And you're also not supposed to remember it exactly the way it happened for a very good psychological reason, right? Because memory is not static. Like your memories are not a static thing. They are an evolving thing relative to your current state. And these systems are going to become really bad if all they do is accurately remember things like an SQL database. Like that's a really bad execution of the concept of memory.
Yep.
If you really just think about it, like logically, it's like I don't remember, you know, how I fell off my bike as a kid when I was 8. Now, the way I did a year after it happened when I was 9, like, you know, that's a very natural thing. And I can interact with the world as a person with memory in a much more nuanced way because of the fact that my memories decay, age, change, all of that sort of stuff, or my understanding, or like the memory slots update, or my, it's the way I interact with you, Cameron, is very different to the way I interact with other friends in my life. Like all of that stuff is just so nuanced that the memory architecture stack that is emerging, that has emerged now, is nowhere near sufficient to take these things to the stage where we would want them to be based on our expectations. And I think
Yeah.
that's why you have the disconnect, and that's why I think a lot of people are saying this is not very good.
Yeah, and I was speaking more on the personal data side of things, and then
Mm.
you introduced on the business side. And just okay, here's an analogy. Have you ever tried to pull your or transfer from like Apple Music to Spotify or any type of service like
Or
that? Even
yeah.
social media, they make it
Yeah, yeah.
it's impossible, right?
I just
Well,
recently went from Apple to Android.
yeah, I'm sorry. That must have been painful. So think about that, because if you become highly dependent on your personalized AI and it's hard to get out or impossible to get out, then you're stuck. You're right.
Yeah, the lock in, like the moat, if someone
Hmm.
gets it right, is significant. And that's obviously why it's important and why they're working on it, because it's a natural moat, right? Now, there are ways to get out of that, right? So if you build your own stack using something like LangChain and then you use other tools like Zep, Letter, which is based on Graffiti, or I always get those two confused. I think Graffiti is Zep, and then I believe Letter was based on the Mem GPT paper.
Yep. Right.
And they all have different approaches. LangChain as well, like with LangMem, based on just a simple SQL database. That's a better approach, right? But the problem is, like, if all of your users are interacting, say if you've got a big company that's like 3,000 people that's on an enterprise ChatGPT account, then you're never leaving, right? You're never leaving that stack.
Exactly. I talk about this paper all the time. I know I've mentioned it to you, and but there's a paper that was published in 2023 by Lillian Wang. She was a previously an OpenAI researcher. The paper is called LLM powered autonomous agents, and it
Yeah.
talks about in order the combination of things you need for AGI, and it's memory. It's basically memory, tools, and then different levels of thinking and decomposition. So if you read that and then take a look at where we're at today, it might bring some things to light for you. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
I think on
I
the,
read this paper. I've read this paper so many times. I didn't hear a ton about it when it came out, and I still think it's one of the most spot on, kind of easy to read pieces on this topic.
chuck it in the reading list. I think on that, actually, one thing I did see, which is more practical, I guess, and related to the memory front, is when you're using these systems, the practical part of memory, like if we're really just talking about building apps that kind of remember basic stuff, is context length and context stuffing, like basically getting the right memory context, getting the right memories, quote, memories as an artifact or an object or a data, into the context window at the right time relative to the user's requirement. Like in a practical sense, when you're building an application, that's the current problem set. Rue Code. Have you ever used Rue Code?
That's
Those
the fork
guys?
of Klein. I
Yeah,
have barely.
yeah.
I use Klein primarily, but barely
Yeah,
use Root.
it's similar to Klein. I've never really used it, but I saw it come through. Those guys released a thing that which is called context compression, which is basically like trying to get around this context expansion issue without having to really go into a memory store all of the time. What we do as humans is very interesting around that. Like we have our own version of context compression with memories, and we use emotion, stories, and a range of other things to basically compress our context around certain situations so you can have a pattern recognition set in any given scenario, and then you can go back into your human level context and have a pattern recognition for an outcome that's based on either a story you've heard or emotions you've felt in similar situations. That's a shortcut. So you don't have to remember everything, but you know what to do in a certain situation, or you know how a certain situation may play out. We don't really have a good digital version of that cognitive architecture that humans have, which I think is an interesting area to explore. Yeah.
Let me, and that's why I brought up the paper actually. And the big part I skipped over there is the comparison to the human brain. And it breaks down different types of storage and memory in comparison to the human brain. So you mentioned like, short term versus long term,
Yeah.
um, and all those different layers. It's not necessarily like a CRUD database. Go save all these
Yeah.
memories here. There are going to be, and are, I shouldn't say will be, multiple different layers and different types of architecture that make up the big picture and are for very specialized areas of that memory. And this is this is the yeah, very interesting. Go read it if you haven't.
On that, just go up to the chart before. So this is their like mental model of the memory types, right? Or rendering down into some sort of taxonomy. If you
Exactly.
think about, yeah, this isn't really how they're equating out memory within these kind of architectures that are within the stack that you can just hook into at the moment, right? But also it's sort of a bit bigger because like it's important not to anthropomorphize like an LLM is just a prediction engine, right? It's just like too much.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I agree.
Maybe I've got it wrong because the nature of memory when it relates to a prediction engine is could and probably is very, very different architecturally to like cognitive architecture. Maybe it's just completely different. Maybe we just haven't discovered what the best mechanism and data set and modeling is yet. Mm, that's cool. I'll definitely read that. All right. Thanks. That was a good read me corner. I liked it. Yeah. Would you like to do creative deep dive?
Yeah, educate me.
Have you used any like generative AI, but specific creative tools in anger other than just like a bit of stable diffusion? Like, have you actually ever tried to do anything production grade or for work with them?
No, not necessarily. I started off early with stable diffusion, and yeah, I can't say that I've done real work with them. And on it, in fact, I've stayed away from audio and video type stuff because I really thought to myself like, man, these are just kind of play things. Like this is not what I need to be spending on my time on. But
Mm.
I think I was very wrong on that.
Well, I guess you're not like you don't work in advertising and marketing or something like that. So I feel like
Right.
I
Yeah.
guess
Right.
you might not necessarily need to as much, but sometimes we all need to. I was just wondering because not everyone has engaged with these tools. I saw a study by Google that they released around like types of workers and the kinds of generative AI tasks that they engage with. And basically anyone who works in advertising and marketing is using them like 80 to 90% of the time. And well, 80 to 90% of the people are using them. And then on the other categories of professionals, white collar professionals, it's like anywhere between like 10 to 30% in that category in this kind of area. So there's a big disconnect. I used them a fair bit, like we all did, and then I found that they were just being built in this point solution architecture. So what I want to go through is sort of talk through where they've been, the state, and how these apps kind of evolved in the way that they were structured, and then what's happening now. And I might do a quick demo. I've got a few views on like how I reckon the category is going to flesh out, but I think it's going to get really good really fast for a specific set of tasks. And um, I think we'll see proper agentic workflows emerge, which hasn't really happened in this category yet. Like when you think about like the Devon and the codexes and those sorts of things, like we don't have that version in this category, but I think it will start to emerge as a result of some of the things I want to talk about. So I went on this deep dive as a result of seeing like all these people creating this skeuomorphic kind of like icons that but oh, here's an icon and I can animate it. All right, I was like, all right, well, this is kind of fun. Let's dive back into it. It might just be worth rehashing. So the field came from classification, like it started back when we were trying to figure out if we could just classify things into cats and dogs, right? You remember that? This is way
Mm-hmm.
back, like when
AlexNet stuff, right?
AlexNet, right? And then it emerged into diffusion models, right? And diffusion models were incredible. I'm still amazed that diffusion models actually work. Diffusion model basically trains on a data set where you have an image and then they progressively load in static over time. And then the model learns to, via a sequence of steps, retrofit that image back from the static into the actual image that you like the original image, and it learns that process back and forth. It's more complicated than that. There are lots of different versions, but that was sort of the one that came out originally, and I've got a little visual
Well, with
I'll
stable
pull
diffusion,
up.
that was cool. You could actually basically watch that happen in real time, right? I don't
Yeah.
know with these other tools, it all just happens in the background. So maybe they should retro that. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, well, like some of them do, which is kind of cool. And I'll pull up a couple of demos of some of the things that they do show you. And what they're trying to do is draw you into the user, into the creative experience, right? And that was a very basic version, which is like, this is how we create it. And now the tools are moving into like, interact with it, and then we'll render down the version that you kind of describe. Because the LLM, the diffusion models had like a text encoder as well, which is like, all right, here's the diffusion back and forth pass. And then the text encoder was like, all right, give me a picture of a cat in a hat at a dinner party.
Mm-hmm.
And then that would render over the top of that effectively, or in the context of that. And yeah, it's just unbelievable. That's like 2020 to 2022. The reason why this is important is because obviously VO3 came out. So I wanted to talk through sort of what's happened since then. Basically, we just went through like similar to the LLM world, we just went through like a power kind of performance gain period where they were just throwing more compute at it, and they were just getting better and better and better and better and better. And there are specific benchmarks in this category that emerged around that are still relevant, that are not talked about very much. There's like benchmarks for like how many fingers do I have, and all of those sorts of things that were the basic errors that were emerging through that time. One thing that I found interesting when I was looking into this is how actually VO got to the point that they're at. So they have, so if I step back, there's the diffusion into an image, and then there is the image into a video diffusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then over the top of that, VO also has the audio track. So it's really, truly multimodal. It's pretty exceptional, right?
That's the first one with audio, right?
I'm not sure. I don't think so, but yeah, I'm not sure. But
It's
also,
the first
like,
one that I've used with audio, and it changes things quite a bit. It's really impressive.
yeah. And I don't know if that was just user demand or whether it was technical challenge, because when I've built, so I have built a range of like production ready kind of things in the marketing space using these tools. And I always prefer using the voice generation models because I get the comps and I can do all of the sequencing and the cuts independently, like using basically the human in the loop factor in this category is really high. Like there's a really high requirement for the human in the loop in this category compared to, say, the coding or the email agent, whatever. Like the human really demands to be involved in a way that is not present in some of those other categories as much. What VO has is this, like, these video things is this shared latent space, effectively, is what they call it. So, and the way that they actually built their model from some of the information that they've shared is they basically render down, like every 2 seconds across the space, they'll render down the image sequence. So if you 8 second long, they've got like 7 images that define the sequence. And then they use a specific model to render down all of the frames within that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next challenge that they had was like, well, how do I keep consistency? So how do I make sure Cameron and Tom are still in the frame, but they're actually kind of going surfing or, driving a car? And then the next challenge in the background of the research was basically these models figured out that they could vectorize like images or concepts or characters that the model could reference as it's rendering down that sequence. So it could always keep reference to the character or the scene or the object or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And that was on top. What is interesting about this category also is that, yeah, the big companies are leading, but the second, like if you go to artificial analysis, which is a ranking some of the models are not the big companies or not as big in the LLM space, which is, I found interesting. And there are always these small teams that are really breaking the soda level on specific vectors. So for example, the DIE model came out and it was just way better at real kind of interactive representation of interactive audio. And it was just generated by a couple of grad students. And it was really good. So it's a real breakout category where, in comparison to, say, LLMs, which is like, unless you've got billions of dollars, like you're just not going to play in that space. Which is pretty cool. So all of that's to say, on the VO front, basically they brought in these specific innovations around some of these things, and now they're at the top. So there's the VBench 2, which is kind of like the leading kind of benchmark, and they're way at the top of that. And then Meta also has this movie gen kind of benchmark, and they've beaten that as well. But it's super expensive still. So I looked up the pricing. It's 4K, a 1 minute of 4K video on Google Cloud for VO3 is $18. If you imagine you have to render down a bunch of these videos over and over again, because sometimes it won't get the scene right, sometimes it won't do this, the instruction set, because the instruction set is still just putting the text prompts in. Then you might do that 5 times, right? And that's $100. Like, it's just not feasible for, like, unless you are a production studio. And that's where I think it's going to go next with some of the demos I want to show you, is like rendering it out from just like, all right, give me the scene and here's the text, and then maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, have to go again. To actually having more control, more directive control over the actual scene. But the other thing I found interesting about it was it was all trained on TPU clusters. They didn't use GPUs. They used the Google specific chips, which I thought was pretty fascinating. I'm surprised that didn't get more traction unless I wasn't paying attention properly. Do you know much about those TPUs?
Especially with it being video, at least based on, I would think that GPUs are video graphics cards, right?
Well, yeah, that's
originally. Yeah. I mean,
originally, yeah,
yeah,
and that's why NVIDIA is so massive in this space, right? They have their own versions of these models and they have their own domains. I'll show you a few, but yeah. Did you see the prompt theory video?
I don't think
the
so.
VO prompt theory. Someone generated like a bunch of people and actors imagining they were like the prompt theory, which is like, oh, we're all just prompts. And it's very meta. It was pretty funny, but I think it raises a really good point. Is like, that was a person's creative effort went into the creation of that idea. It's very simple, very funny video, but someone thought of the creative concept. Like, that wasn't generated by a model, right? It was, the video output was, but the creative idea wasn't, which I think is the primary category issue.
Yeah, and I don't know how much time you have, but if we had time, I'd like to talk more about that and your thoughts on at what point can you really call it, your creation art? Because you're right, it takes some level, like it's your ideas. But I never considered anything I made with stable diffusion like art, or would say this is art I made, But some of these other things, like I mentioned the Rick Rubin 3JS thing, I think at some point you can call that your art. And then I always compare like a lot of these things with AI to music production. So it's funny that Rick Rubin is the person who kind of publicized that thing. But yeah, if we have time, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, you and I are both musicians, but I guess this is sort of what happens every time a new thing comes out. Is like the old guard will say, or the people from the old medium will say, this isn't real. I find it hard, like it is kind of hard to look at, like you just writing a prompt and say, give me a picture of a cat, and then you kind of claiming that that's like art. But there are digital artists who emerged, right, in this space. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and you could say the same about music. I mean, think about sampling, right? A lot of people, including like real musicians who have had their music sampled and they don't like it, and they're like, this is not art, this is not a creation, you just recycled my art. And then you have others that are like, yeah, totally, it's a tool.
Yeah,
right. Exactly. And I see a lot of these things very similarly.
Yeah, exactly. I might take you through this briefly. So can you see my screen okay? Is it
I can.
Not too large?
Yeah, cowboy.
Sweet cowboy. So that's like the state of the art of where we are on like that creative vertical. Or creative kind of process sort of capture is what I would probably describe it as, like how the models are capturing the creative process. But the UI layer in this kind of creative domain is pretty interesting, and I think worth kind of talking about briefly. Most of the products that have emerged are still node based, And I think and when I say node based, it's sort of like you just link up the UI and you connect bits together, or you do specific tasks in the creative process one at a time, or just that point solution. So you create a storyboard. This is a product called, I'll spin through a few of the products I like, but LTX Studio. You create a storyboard, for example, and then you concept design, which is very like just, like when we took theater went into film, it was like, it felt like you were just watching a silent, like just a theater show, but like in a film. It's very much like that. And it's still kind of stuck. A lot of these products are still stuck in that mindset, which is like, all right, just embed the prior process of creating an ad, a movie, whatever, concept, storyline, cast, breakdown into the software. And then you go into each part and you have a point solution task that is executed on top of that. And all of it is, from what I can tell anyway, a lot of the way that these products are actually built. So this one here, I'll come back to that because it's got some cool kind of features. They're based on these node systems as I described, and a lot of them are actually they hook into, say, this is a good example of a node one. This is called Flora Fauna. This is an example where like this is one of their templates. So you've got like the storyboard someone sketched up, and then that is pulled into an actual analysis card, and that card comes into the the train conversation scene, and it renders down just that one scene, and then you take it out into a model and into an actual diffusion kind of model call effectively. That process is pretty basic. So you got like I pulled up one here so you can see the example is I've got an image here. I've got some text. I said I want that's a prompt, a story about a podcast and its hosts to take over the world, podcast world domination, and that'll be just like a chunk that we have. And then I can just pull in another, I don't know, image card, and I can literally just say, well, this is your imagery kind of inspiration, and here is your story, and then you go off and generate, and then it generates it out, and then you build all of these complex kind of workflows. Fowl.ai is one of these kind of diffusion and creative developer platforms that basically power a lot of these things, which would be very familiar. I think I shared with you Flowise, which is built on top of LangChain. It's sort of similar. And literally, if you look at some of the ways that these things are built, each one of those cards, each one of those workflows is literally just a highly involved kind of prompt to model call to response output kind of structure. So if you imagine each one of those cards has a embedding of this workflow, and then all of the details that you can kind of add onto the actual behavior. So for example, I might like pull in another card which has variance or negative prompts, and all it is like, all right, a negative prompt might be a keyword in this product, and it just like basically says, well, don't make it look like sci-fi, make it look like a Western, whatever. So the app layer is actually quite thin when you consider that, when you look at like the actual output here.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but I'm curious if you are familiar with Comfy UI. I'm sure you've tried that, right? So how does this...
Yeah. It's basically exactly the same. So
except with Comfy UI, it's a lot more like parameters and stuff rather than natural language, is what I'm gathering at the moment. Is that
So well, these guys, they have a Comfy UI interface as well. You can just create a Comfy UI variant effectively. So this is like way more detailed than Comfy UI, right? But you're exactly right. It's like Comfy UI. Each one of these creative apps seems to be just a whole stack of very complicated Comfy UI or like workflow executions underneath.
Okay.
That define certain outputs. Now, obviously that's not simple to do, but I think the reason why we haven't seen any high execution agents in this space yet is, number one, some of the tech needs to evolve a little bit more. Number two, it's quite expensive. But number three, the way that these systems are built doesn't really lend itself to that agent kind of interface. I can't just expose an agent to these elements. That system doesn't really exist as much.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so this is Comfy UI. You can play with that. Like, have you played with that much? I don't know. It's a bit complicated for me. I don't really
I have. So
dive into it.
so you said this is like additionally on top of Comfy UI. So does that make it easier to use or harder, more difficult?
It's a simplification layer. So, for example, like Flora Fauna, if I just go back to this one, it's a simplification on top of those more advanced tools like Comfy UI, because I can basically just say, right, the card that I'm pulling in is just an image card, right? And then I can just ask it a question. I can turn an image into a video. I can combine images into a video, and then I can, add a prompt. But behind the scenes, behind that layer, there is all sorts of more complicated Comfy UI levels of abstraction that you don't see as a user
Mm-hmm.
that you can build on top of as a developer. You can use, say, a system like Fal.ai, which has, it's effectively like it's like a model kind of provider. Replicate.com is another one like this. And you can build your creative tooling on top effectively to give you that abstraction layer above it. In this kind of creative UI flow anyway.
Mm-hmm. I'm excited to check that out, Tom, because yeah, Comfy UI, I set it up and messed with it, but it was like side quest after side quest, I'd like every little thing I tried to do as a research project, it seemed like.
Yeah. So these are a lot of fun to use. They are. But again, like unless you have a specific task and you're familiar with it, it still seems kind of clunky to me, basically. So the task output is like, all right, if I really wanted to produce a work ad, like an ad for where I work, because I run marketing at the company I work at the moment, like this is still pretty cumbersome. Like I want an agent to be able to execute this for me. That's number one. Number two, it's like, it's still one chunk. So when I create this, you see this with the VO thing as well, like it's still just 8 seconds, right? Like an 8-second video. The other factor, which is what I want to talk about next, is I can't direct what's going on in a three-dimensional environment. Say, for example, in video, which is what I want to go into next. This is good for, pieces of creative. But if I want to go into a really, intense kind of video production state, I can't actually get involved on the directional side of things. But directional is in like act like a director and have more control. But what I think is going to happen, and what I'd like to demo for you, is I think that's going to change. So about
I'm surprised to hear, and you have a lot more experience on this. I'm surprised to hear that. So you're telling me that up until now, or maybe still challenging, that you can't just say like do a 360 or like be very specific about your shots and like do a 360 view, or is there more to it that you're trying to do that's more advanced? Because that seems basic to me.
Oh, no, you can, like, so, sorry, let me rephrase. You're exactly right. You can do that. So this is an example I wanted to show you. So this is a video I generated before, just here, of this, little guy on a horse. And what this category of apps that has emerged has developed is a way for you to actually execute on that. So in this case, you can do those things. So you can have a start frame and an end frame. You define where it is, and then it'll take you there. So if you can generate an end frame, it'll just generate a motion pass as if the camera was doing it. Mm-hmm. And that's been around for a while. Like that has been around for a while, but it's not reliable in that, like, a lot of creative, like, production kind of producing people will have a key metric, which is like number of passes before I get to the shot that I want. They often have to generate it many times. The models are getting better, but for example, in this case, if I go camera control, so I'll start with this one. I can show you what I did. This is the example frame, and I might go movement type. All right, the start frame here. So what I actually did was like, all right, they've rendered it down to components, and then I can basically say what I actually wanted was a zoom into that point. If I delete this,
I thought it was cool with Sora was the first one I saw where you could start editing. Maybe it wasn't the first, but it made it really easy for things like that.
Yeah. Well, these guys are pretty cool because they render it into a three-dimensional. They attempt to render a chunk of it into three-dimensional space, and then you
Oh,
can say, "All right,
that,
zoom in over there," and then I apply, and then you generate it.
I'm sorry. I
And you can
missed. You're not talking about camera angles. You're talking about three-dimensional objects.
Well, this is the first step, right? These guys have a really good UI interaction plus kind of like a basic way to generate it. But the problem is it's number one, it's super slow. Like this is really slow to do. But it's different to prompting and just saying, hey, like create a drone flyover of the cowboy. And
Mhm.
then whatever you get is whatever you get. And then you'd have to try again and try again and try again. These guys, they're trying to get you more control. But what I want is literally total control over the scene. So I thought about how to do that. So if we look at like, we'll see this coming out in a second. I thought about how to do that. And if you remember, Harrison and the Langchain guys talked about code act, which is
Mhm.
basically just saying like a good way to get deterministic outputs from an AI is to have them execute within code, you see. All right. That wasn't really what I asked for, right? That wasn't really the angle. I wanted to zoom in over there, but instead the horse rode off in that direction. That's a classic example. Um, uh, yeah, so he basically said like a good way to direct, and they had an interesting video on this last week, is a good way to direct is basically give the AI code to execute in. So I was trying to think through, all right, how would you do that in the creative space? LLMs, in terms of their coding ability, are very good at JavaScript. It's the one thing that they do a lot of. And we were talking about 3JS before, right? Which is HTML. And then a very large ecosystem of people emerged around React. It was like React version of 3JS. So not just HTML, but React components. And it's called React 3 Fiber. So this is an example of it, where you can render down in a web environment a 3D, a 3-dimensional kind of scene, anything really. There's heaps of examples in the React 3 Fiber site, and there's all sorts of packages. Like it's a rich ecosystem. It's been going for ages. You know, physics, like elements, yeah, camera angles, lighting, all sorts of stuff, and you can render these things into a 3D environment, which is really cool. If you could then overlay an agent an agent interface into that, so you've got a code environment where the agent can execute on, and a human like overlay. So that's sort of what I was trying to build or trying to get to. And there are a couple of projects that are emerging around this, but they're still very much dev projects. They're not like in the actual production creative environment for like people who are not technical to use.
Yep. And
But that was sort
last
of what I
week,
was thinking, like encode your video as code, bring it in as code, make it code that the LLMs are great at, and then you can direct the scene in a 3-dimensional space and re-render down whatever camera angle you want. That's sort of what I'm wanting. Sorry, what were you going to say?
no, I agree. And I was going to say last week I made the comparison. We were talking about code execution sandboxes, and I made the comparison of something like up to this point we had our LLMs had a piece of scratch paper. Now we've
Mm.
given them a computer, a dedicated computer they can use themselves. Imagine what that did for humans. So just think about, how much of a game changer that is. And that's kind of what you're speaking to here. And it's like, I'm hearing it as it's like comparing a two-dimensional drawing on a piece of paper to like a full 3D. Uh, it's like art in code, I guess, and it gives you much more control. But that wouldn't be possible without the sandboxes and the code execution, right?
Well, well, yeah, like in short, it is possible, but the way that this has been done in the coding environments and the production environments is through Unreal Engine and all these other kind of game tools, and also in the AR space. Like this is a built-out environment where the 3D kind of rendering of these 3D environments is pretty well developed. But the thing that I haven't been able to find, which I wanted to get to, was that I want an interface for the agent that's effective, and it's also something that they know about, right? So an agent knows how to build React, like an LLM knows how to build a React app. Like we definitely 100% know that that is true. But like an MCP server, like connected to Blender, did you see that version that came out a while back? It was like people building stuff with Blender. Like it was cool, but it definitely wasn't simple, right? It's not an environment necessarily that's easy to just dump an LLM in. So what I want something is a sandbox, as you're describing, that an LLM is great at, that can render the creative like vision. It's not quite there yet, but a couple of these demos I want to show you will hopefully give you a sense, and then I'll show you a couple of the models called Nerf models, which is emerged a couple of years ago, which are getting much better as well, which is sort of the next step of this idea. So this is a React 3 Fiber concept, and then I basically looked around and tried to figure out, right, well, what were some packages and tools that would give me control? One of them is Remotion.dev, and these guys basically built a couple of years ago, they built like a coding, effectively it was like a coding environment for animations. So it's I've just installed it here, but you can go Remotion Dev is where you get it. I'll just make this bigger so you can see it. Is that all right size?
Yep.
So it's a basic React app. You've got like your index here and the scene that's rendered. The scene is rendered down with these components, like the React version of 3JS. And then it imports each of the elements in the scene as React components. And those components are here. Rounded box and a phone. Here's the phone, etc. And I'm just going to find this so we can actually look at it, which is the scene. So side by side, they basically have a interaction kind of area where you can interact with your React rendered kind of video in real time. This has been out for a while, right? This isn't really that groundbreaking, but what is cool about it is that there is a pretty rich ecosystem of packages out there that render down video and creative content in code. So that was the first step of looking at that. The next step is, all right, that's Remotion. The next step is another package which I found, which is these guys, Triplex, pardon me. They took it to the next step, which is, it's not a very actively managed repo. It's actually a bit old now. But what they actually did, if I'll just get rid of that, and you can see this is a similar, like it's a React package. This is their website. I'll share it in the links. They took it a next step further and said, right, well, with React 3 Fiber, can I render down an actual interactive environment that gives me control over the scene? So they've got this overlay, and they also have a desktop app as well. And this is a VS Code plugin where you can say, all right, for any function within your exported function, which is an object in your React 3 Fiber scene, you can then open it in the viewer. So for example, here, open in Triplex, and then it will open this scene on the side here. And it actually gives you an interactive UI. If I just sort of zoom in, you can see, all right, I can actually, in real time, I can see my scene. So I zoom in, this is my scene. This is actually the camera angle. So you can define the camera angle, and then you can define animations in code, but also interact with it as a user over the top of that. So this is a floating ball. I can redefine where that goes. I can change the layout. I can actually change where the camera sits. And then for each of those components, you can render it down into an actual scene that plays out as a video or as an animation. These things move at a certain pace. It has physics engine. It also has interactivity. This is more for web things. So in this example, you can actually say, all right, well, I want these balls to move around here. I want this to change over here, but I can actually see what's happening in real time with the agent as I prompt and plan within Cursor. So I could actually interact. the cursor agent or your agents that you build can interact with the code and render it down in real time while the user can also interact with it at the same time.
That is, yeah, that's really interesting. And is that, I hear people talking about like just in time video games or like self generative video games. Is this even in the same ballpark as far as the technology? And I don't mean to put you on the spot on the random
I,
video game reference, but
I think a lot of that, well, a lot of what you're describing is like there's a whole industry around this happening in the specific toolkit and tooling that a lot of those industries use, right? So Unreal Engine or any of those things. NVIDIA, which I'll talk about next, they have their own kind of ecosystem of digital twin development engines that do commercial work or like are used in robotics, a bunch of that sort of stuff. So it's a pretty rich environment where you generate scenes and then you develop like you put characters in there, and then they have kind of effectively like an interaction state that's unique to the user or the context, all of those sorts of things. I'm not a big gamer, so it's not really my domain. But I have heard a lot about that. One of the problems I believe with a lot of these models is the speed. Like, so the speed of rendering is kind of tough, but if you're using a game engine, it's not as bad. This isn't necessarily a game engine. It's actually just it's using web technology to render down visuals, right?
right.
And the only reason I want this is because I know that Claude is great at web. And I want the next step is what I want is to develop, which is the thing I'll show you next, is the next step in the chain is getting an image, rendering it down into this environment and enabling me to basically say, all right, well, rather than just saying I want the camera to fly over the cowboy's shoulder, I can click on this or whatever it is, and I can point the camera angle at on the specific path that I want it to go on at the specific moment in the scene and render it down, and the agent can reflect that in code and give me the output. So it has the potential, I think, using these kinds of tools to give people what they want, which is really like, I want to be a director and I want to have my stage and I want to say, I want the actors to say what I want. I want the person to move in this way. I want the dog to run across in this specific way. And currently the creative tools and where they're executing is like, all right, well, you do it 20 times and then one of the 20 times works and then you use that one. Meanwhile, you've burnt through how much VO money, right? It's a lot.
Right.
So this is a really cool thing to play with, like, because you can then go in and like the interaction on these isn't great. That's why I said it's like, this is like a developer tooling environment. Like this is not consumer grade. You couldn't release something like this as a product because it's confusing and hard. And you can't just say, all right, we'll move that over there. Like then you change the props. Like it's all very technical, but the ability to actually direct these things is potentially there.
Have you tried some of these same things in Claude Desktop?
Rendering down 3JS.
Yeah, it's not going to be full on production what you need, but I actually this is kind of funny. Can I share my screen for a second?
It's pretty cool. I've done it a few times, so sorry, I'll stop presenting.
So as you were talking through that, and like I was basically just trying to compare. So I was replicating. Yeah. I started with, sorry for all the Rick Rubin references, but started with the Rick Rubin. This is you can't click or drag it around, but as you can see, this is Arda's code. And the reason that I started with that was just to quickly grab like the correct libraries and everything. And then I completely, this is so bad though, so I turned it to that first and then said, turn it into a cowboy scene. And it wasn't, it's like Minecraft.
That's great.
But so yeah, silly. It doesn't look good, but the interactive, like being able to move around and I'm curious how that compares. Like you said, I mean,
well, that's why I think, this is exactly what you're showing me here. And like, because we've seen these so much online, right? This is why I think this path has more legs than going down, say, the game engine path, is because you spun that up so quickly and the interaction is really simple and easy, right?
Yeah.
So it's easy for the LLMs to use React 3 Fiber or like 3JS and React and code up these things. The bit that's missing, which is what I'll talk you through next, is say you've got your cowboy scene and you've got your picture of a cowboy, right? The next, like the thing that you need to do next is basically take your creative and render it into this environment that's sort of a visualization of it, which is like your version, but better. And then be able to plan it out and extract the actual directed video that you want to come out of it, or the creative you want to come out of it in multiple different ways, rather than just having to say, do it again, do it again, do it again.
Exactly. And
Now,
it's funny, I was trying to explain this exact thing to a guy at this school, guy, like a dentist, and I didn't get there, but I was trying to explain like why that opens up so many more doors as code, and you can modify it with an image generation model. It's you get an output back and that's it, and then you want to modify it, go back, try again. This is much more iterative when you have as code.
yeah, but the challenge is getting it into the code format that makes sense, is usable. So the models that had emerged for this were, have you heard of Gaussian splatting? It's a terrible name, but
I
it's like
haven't.
basically like there was a class of models that is image to 3D or image to 3D render, and they've been around for a while. They got really popular in like 2022, but they were quite slow. That was one of the problems. Um, but the pipeline for this kind of execution is basically you've got your creative output in those workflow things, and then you render it down into a 3D environment in a way that is high quality. Then pipe out your instructions back into the model to generate. That's the pipeline I'm imagining. There's a specific, which is super exciting around this area, and they're called NERF, which is a fantastic name. These models are called NERF models, which stands for Neural Radiance Field. And basically they emulate light patterns within an environment from an image or a section of images to give you a sense of the depth and the actual environment that you're trying to model. They take ages, or they had been taking ages, but they're getting a lot faster, which means that a pipeline like this could actually work. You could take it from an image, put it into a NERF model, render it out into some sort of React 3 fiber environment. Cameron, you could pick it up in an artifact, play with it and say, look, I want the cowboy to run over there as fast as he can, and I want him to be thrown off the horse in this way. Then he lands on his back, stands up and shoots someone. And that could be programmed into code. You can approve it, then you render it back out, and you've paid Google $20 rather than $200. And I think that unlock, which is coming now, and I'll show you the example, will really make these creative tools so much more powerful. Looking at this has got me excited to actually try some of these NERF kind of projects out. So I'll share with you. You can find them on Hugging Face. There's a bunch of basically 3D, image to 3D or text to 3D models. Many of them are built for gaming. So they're often basically just like rendering down like I don't know, what's called a sprite, which is a character. And that's apparently become like a massive productivity win in the gaming industry. But not as many of them do what's being shown here, which is like render the actual environment down into a three-dimensional space. Nerve Studio is something you can run locally that actually does this kind of rendering. NVIDIA has, I think, the Project Cosmos, which is their version where they're doing it for actual live kind of production environments for robotics. And this is on their platform. And you can see some examples here of like, this is a NERF Radiance field of like a truck, right? That you can then take an image, render it in, and here's some examples where it's got like higher quality resolution. The problem is it takes a long time. For example, here is a NERF kind of structure that actually gives you a sense of this, and you can play with this online, but you basically say, all right, here's a video of a couple of guys sort of standing around. This is the video input. this could be AI generated, whatever you want, and then they render it into their studio environment. I'll skip forward and you can see actually what it does in practice. But basically you can spin it up, and this has been around for quite a few years. You can spin it up and say, all right, I want the camera to actually spin around the users like this. And you can change the smoothness of the camera angles and a range of different things, but it's not in an interactive fashion. I can't add other characters yet. I couldn't like then say, all right, get my sprite and put it over the top, change the camera angle in this way, render me down a particular path of these people walking in that direction now, and then go again. Like you can't like direct it like you would have if you were a director, but you can see the actual kind of technical control, at least on the camera angle front, is actually very high quality. And this is something that anyone can just download, a package anyone can download and play with. The problem then is the actual rendering down of the scene. So for example, I'll show you here, they basically just render it down, and in this case, it takes a while. Nerf, I think there was and that's the end scene that they render, right? Which is much more controlled than just saying, give me a circling kind of reference of people in something like VO3. Still does take time, but some of these models that are coming out and getting better and better are looking to accelerate that rendering process so that it could go into code, go into an environment like that, come back out. So it's super exciting. Like,
this is super interesting. I mean, on the surface, I'm like, aren't we pretty much talking about the metaverse here? Like, how is it different conceptually? And
yeah,
for me, I think of video games as the metaverse, but
yeah.
that's not necessarily true.
Well, you're right. Yeah, you're right. You're right in a couple of ways. In that, what I was saying earlier in the demo is the gaming and AR and VR world. They're all over this concept, right? And it's very well defined and very well developed. But it's not an easy space for you to just enter with an agent. So it doesn't enable the web app environment to go into it very well with an AI kind of augmented user experience. That's my main problem with it. Is like those domains are very specialized and they're very defined, and they're not something that agents and LLMs are great at yet. Might be, like maybe MCPs will just come out that are way better and blow this idea out of the water. But right now, today, I know that LLMs are great at React. They're really good at that. They're probably the best in the world, right? So the interface is like the web technology is the primary interface that I see where these will get better in the short term for regular users. If you work in the gaming industry, like you're not going to be using something like this, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why they make the comparison, because at least in my mind, when I think of the metaverse, it's like all the Mark Zuckerberg stuff, and that's all running in data centers. But this is like maybe like I don't know if the right word, but maybe like an abstraction of the metaverse. I don't know. Like
I hate the term the metaverse. Just putting that on the record.
literally meta, what we're talking about here.
Yeah. I think like the real unlock for these creative tools, if I could like wrap that up, I'm going to put the metaverse to the side for one moment, is Neil Stevenson, thank you so much for that term, is like in order to get the creative control and also the agentic workflows that exist in coding right now, I think that Kodak framework for your creative tooling is a great vector that I don't think enough apps and people are exploring based on that little kind of discovery process I went through there. The apps, like the packages are there, the developer tooling is there, and the inference for these creative models is there, but it's not really being put together in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Maybe I should do it, or someone listening to this should do it.
Yeah, well, thanks for taking my just kind of out there questions, but it's quite a bit different than what I focus on. So thank you for that. It's really, really interesting. Yeah. And now I have another set of things to dive into.
Yeah. The reason why I'm interested in it is because I worked in advertising marketing for a long time on both the client side and the agency side. And I think the way that the industry is approaching it is a reflection of their structure. Whereas with better tools and better control, companies would be able to take back a lot of ownership of these things and reduce the cost by not just, it's probably gone down by 10x for a lot of creative tasks as a result of what's happened over the past 2 years. With better tools, you might be able to take it down another 10x. But that workflow will need to change. And I think when those things happen, a lot of people will just stop paying their agencies and stop paying a lot of these companies and bring it all in house, or have a few people that do a bunch of these different things enabled by agents that are very good at video production that can actually do it in practice across these tools.
Right. Right.
As opposed to just like someone sitting down clicking and doing it for hours and hours. It's just one person as opposed to a production team.
Yeah, most businesses are going to appreciate that. I'm curious for you, Tom, and I don't know the answer to this question. You mentioned you're pretty much like a marketing person, but you're also technical.
Don't hold it
So
against me.
which one came first, and why did the other one follow?
I started as a musician, right? Which is, something we talked about. That was the creative domain that I started in. And then when I went out and started working, that's where I started working in marketing and advertising. That's where I started my career. And then I picked up the tech side afterwards. So that's sort of what my progression was. I don't love advertising. Like, I'm not an advertising person. I like marketing if it's good, and generally good marketing is based on good products, and that's sort of what I prefer. But I know that you can create great businesses via good marketing and good advertising. So it does have its place.
Right. Right. What was it specifically that made you dive into the tech side? And what is different from then to today? And how impactful?
You mean from when I started getting into the tech world?
Right. Right. There was something that made you go, "Oh man, this is going to apply to what I do. I need to learn more about this." What point was that?
I think it was just so I don't know if you know much about the advertising marketing world, but it's pretty alluring, particularly when you're young. So I was in my 20s then. It was more like my vanity. So I was into that world because it was fun and exciting, and like, I got to go to awesome parties and stuff. And then eventually I was just like, you know what, I'm just a massive nerd. Like, I just need to go and do the thing that actually, do the thing that you do when no one's around, like, which was just like, browse GitHub repositories.
That's
I was
awesome.
like, you're right, I need to make this my career. At the time, my first jump, I was working at a digital agency. So that's sort of how I went in back in the day when digital agencies were still a thing. And the concept of digital, that's how old I am, was new. This was back before Facebook had an advertising program and, all those sorts of things. And that was my first foray. And then I started my first tech company after that. And that was a tech media business effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I also got addicted to the pace, I think, is another part of it. Like the pace of working in software is the pace, and the distribution is just not something that you can really compare to. You
Oh
can
yeah.
actually, if you've got good ideas, you can touch a lot of people, and yeah.
Christmas for you every single day, literally.
What about you?
How what got me into technology?
Yeah, or becoming a developer and like,
Yeah,
it's like,
I started playing the guitar when I was like 14, 13 or 14, and then deciding what I wanted to do after high school. There was a bit I thought I was going to become a recording engineer, mix engineer, something like that.
mm,
I decided against that because I was sitting like in my mom's basement on her laptop recording music that I thought at the time, I was like, man, like this is pretty good. I don't even know if this career is going to exist. And in hindsight, uh, I guess it depends who you ask, but it there's still a place for it. Studios haven't gone away. There's still a lot of successful producers and engineers that do things non-traditionally. But that's really what it was music and recording my own music. And that's why today I still compare the agent engineers and a lot of these things that we're doing
mm,
in the AI world to music production. And as you know, in music production, you have your main recording software, your digital audio workstation, and then you have all these plugins or add-ons or
mm,
like integrations. And each one of those does something very specific. And a lot of times they're very complex. So to be a good producer, you have to understand in and out all of those tools because you can
yeah,
easily take things very backwards with like 2 clicks of something if you don't know what you're doing, like compression. Oh man, now it sounds like garbage, right? So I compare that to a lot of the things
Yeah.
in the AI world where we have, especially the open source side, you have an insane number of tools, and a lot of them are little modules or things that you kind of piece together. So um, I still use that analogy all the time. But yeah, that's what got me started, and now it feels more
Mm.
even more relevant to what I'm doing than ever before.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that. Like, yeah, I think you're right. Like, we both had our stint in the electronic music world. That was the first like exposure I had to a real software company that I really loved was when I was doing a lot of music production on Ableton Live and becoming more and more involved in that community. And everyone that I would meet actually at the meetups I would run, I was living in Melbourne in Australia at the time. Like one out of every two people who would come would be a developer, like
Hmm.
100%. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I don't know, yeah, if you ever dive really hard into synthesis, but trying to understand how to build sounds via a synthesizer, via digital synthesizers is like, I think a great training ground for becoming a technical person.
You know, you were showing the Flora, I think it was, and I was the
Mm.
first thing I thought of was it like a reactor?
Max for live, Max for
Yeah,
live.
like it's like still the same layout
Yeah,
as some of those early plugins, you know.
yeah. Node-based workflows. I'm breaking you out of that. We're going from that to 3D. That's where we're going.
Yep, yep. Well, now we
All
have
right,
to do
mate.
the now we have to do the Ableton MCP next time, I guess.
We should definitely do that, actually. The founder of Spotify, not Spotify, Shopify, is a mad keen Ableton Live producer, and he pushed it out there on his channels at some point. He's like, "Oh yeah, just
Nice.
making some music with Ableton."
That's
Yeah,
another thing. That's just one more thing where I was like, no, I thought of. I'm not going to claim like he stole my idea or anything like that, but it's something that I thought about it. I was like, I know that you can do these things with Ableton, but that's not really what I need to spend my time on. And then it comes out, and it gets a bunch of attention, and I actually set it up like last week, and it's way cooler than I thought it would be. I'll be honest.
yeah. I don't know if the world needs another old men twiddling knobs channel, but we can give it a try.
Yeah.
All right, mate. I'm gonna go. This has been a great
Cool, Tom.
conversation.
It's been a blast. Yeah. We'll talk to you next time.
Next week. All right. See ya.
Yeah. Next
Bye.
week. Thanks.